For decades, a government controlled exactly what archaeologists in one African country were allowed to say out loud about who built the largest stone city ever constructed south of the Sahara, not what they were allowed to believe, what they were allowed to publish. One archaeologist was pressured to rewrite his own findings. Guidebooks sold to tourists at the ruins themselves were censored by the state before visitors ever got close enough to read them. The truth had already been dug out of the ground decades earlier, sitting in plain sight in the soil, the pottery, and the stone itself. It took a government collapse before that truth was finally allowed to reach the public it had been kept from the whole time. This isn't a story about scientists slowly, patiently, piecing together a genuinely difficult mystery over the course of a century. The mystery itself was solved shockingly fast within a few decades of the first serious excavation. What took an entire additional lifetime to resolve wasn't archaeology. It was the politics standing directly on top of it, actively blocking an already settled answer from ever reaching the public it belonged to. Here's the site at the center of that decades-long cover-up. Rising out of the granite hills of southeastern Zimbabwe sits a city of stone walls stretching across nearly 1,800 acres, built entirely without mortar, the individual blocks cut and fitted together with a precision skilled enough that the structures have survived largely intact for close to 1,000 years. Archaeologists call it Great Zimbabwe, and at its height, somewhere between the 11th and 15th centuries CE, it functioned as the political and economic capital of a powerful trading kingdom, connected through Indian Ocean trade routes to markets as far away as Persia and China. It was, by any reasonable measure, the largest pre-colonial city ever built anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa. And for most of the 20th century, European colonial authorities in the region insisted, against a steadily mounting pile of physical evidence, that Africans couldn't possibly have built it. The excuses colonial-era writers invented to avoid crediting local African builders ranged from the merely implausible to the genuinely absurd. 19th-century European visitors and early explorers speculated that the ruins must have been constructed by Phoenician traders or Arab merchants, or, in one of the most persistent theories, connected directly to the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, treating Great Zimbabwe as the legendary lost city where Solomon supposedly stored his gold. When actual African-made pottery, tools, and other everyday artifacts turned up during early excavations at the site, the evidence wasn't taken as proof that Africans had lived and worked there. It was reinterpreted instead as proof that Africans had simply moved into a city some other, more civilized foreign population had already abandoned, a framing that let colonial writers acknowledge the physical evidence sitting right in front of them while still refusing to credit the people who had actually built it. The Solomon and Sheba theory in particular proved remarkably durable, in part because it fit so neatly into a broader Victorian-era fascination with biblical archaeology, and in part because it offered European readers a comfortably familiar, biblically sanctioned explanation for something that otherwise directly contradicted their existing assumptions about African history and capability. Portuguese traders who first documented encounters with the ruins as early as the 16th century had already recorded local oral traditions correctly attributing the site to African builders, information that was simply set aside and ignored by later European commentators more interested in connecting the ruins to biblical legend than in taking local historical testimony seriously on its own terms. This wasn't simply casual historical ignorance, drifting along unchallenged. It was actively useful to the colonial project underway in the region at the time. If European settlers could convincingly claim that a sophisticated, wealthy, complex civilization had existed in the area before local Africans arrived, and that local Africans had then somehow displaced or failed to maintain that earlier supposedly foreign civilization, it helped construct a historical justification for European colonization itself. The idea that white settlers weren't conquering anything, merely reclaiming land and infrastructure that rightfully belonged to some earlier non-African civilizational lineage the settlers imagined themselves connected to. Denying Great Zimbabwe's African origins wasn't a minor academic dispute happening at a safe distance from politics. It was doing real political work, providing colonial administrations with a usable historical myth to justify exactly the kind of occupation happening on the ground at the very same time. That political usefulness explains why the myth persisted so stubbornly even after professional archaeologists had already thoroughly debunked it. A historical narrative doesn't need to be true to be useful to the people repeating it, and a narrative actively serving a colonial regime's own self-justification has considerably more staying power than ordinary historical error typically does, precisely because powerful institutions have real incentive to keep it alive, regardless of what the actual evidence says. Great Zimbabwe's foreign origin myth wasn't simply a mistake waiting patiently to be corrected by better information. It was a story certain people needed to keep believing, or at least needed the wider public to keep believing, for reasons that had nothing to do with archaeology at all. The actual archaeological evidence, once serious excavation work finally began, told an entirely different story almost immediately, and it told that story with a consistency that should have ended the debate decades before it actually did. British archaeologist David Randall McIver conducted the first systematic excavation of Great Zimbabwe in 1905 and concluded, based on the pottery, artifacts, and construction methods he documented, that the site was unquestionably African in origin, with no evidence whatsoever connecting it to any of the foreign civilizations popular legend had attached to it. Decades later, in 1929, archaeologist Gertrude Caton Thompson led a more thorough, more methodologically rigorous excavation specifically commissioned to settle the dispute once and for all. Her conclusion was, if anything, even more unambiguous than Randall McIver's had been. The evidence, examined as a whole, pointed to an origin that was, in her own words, unquestionably African, built by the ancestors of the Bantu-speaking peoples who still lived in the surrounding region. Caton Thompson's excavation was specifically designed to be as methodologically airtight as possible. Precisely because she anticipated the political resistance her conclusions would face, she dug through undisturbed archaeological layers rather than relying on artifacts that earlier, less careful excavations had already disturbed or removed from their original context, and she deliberately cross-referenced her findings against comparable Bantu archaeological sites elsewhere in the region, to demonstrate that Great Zimbabwe's construction techniques and material culture fit comfortably within an established, documented pattern of local Bantu-speaking building traditions, rather than representing some kind of unexplained anomaly requiring a foreign explanation. It was, by the professional standards of the era, about as rigorous and carefully defended a piece of archaeological work as anyone could have produced. That should have been the end of the debate. It wasn't, and the reason it wasn't had almost nothing to do with archaeology and everything to do with politics. Southern Rhodesia, the British colonial territory that would eventually become independent Zimbabwe, was governed for most of the 20th century by a white minority settler regime deeply invested in maintaining its own political legitimacy and an archaeological consensus stating plainly that local black Africans had built one of the most impressive pre-colonial cities anywhere on the continent, sat extremely uncomfortably alongside that regime's broader ideological framework. Ian Smith's government, which unilaterally declared Rhodesian independence from Britain in 1965 specifically to preserve white minority rule, actively pressured archaeologists and heritage officials to suppress or soften the established, evidence-based conclusion that Great Zimbabwe was built by local Africans preferring instead to leave the question publicly framed as unresolved or genuinely mysterious, even though the actual archaeological community had already reached firm consensus on the matter decades earlier. Archaeologist Peter Garlake, who worked extensively on Great Zimbabwe research during this period, became one of the most direct casualties of that political pressure. Garlake found himself repeatedly pressured by Rhodesian authorities to omit or soften the site's African origins in official publications and tourist materials intended for public consumption, essentially being asked to misrepresent his own professional archaeological findings to fit a politically convenient narrative the government preferred. Guidebooks sold to visitors at the site itself during this period were directly censored, stripped of the plain archaeological conclusion that African builders had constructed the ruins, replaced instead with vaguer, more ambiguous language designed to leave the question open in visitors' minds, regardless of what the actual excavated evidence had already established with real scientific confidence. Garlake eventually left Rhodesia entirely, unwilling to continue working under conditions that required him to misrepresent his own professional conclusions to satisfy government censors. His departure wasn't an isolated act of individual conscience, so much as a symptom of a much broader institutional problem, an entire national heritage and tourism apparatus, spanning museums, official publications, and licensed tour guides operating at the site itself, all operating under sustained pressure to publicly contradict what the professional archaeological community studying that exact same site had already conclusively established decades earlier. Visitors touring Great Zimbabwe during the height of this period were, in many cases, being actively misled by the very government-approved materials meant to inform them, told the origins of the site remained a mystery, when the archaeologists who had actually excavated it knew otherwise with real confidence. Sit with that for a moment, because it's a genuinely remarkable case of a government actively suppressing settled, well-documented archaeological fact for openly political reasons, not because the underlying science was actually unclear or contested within the field, but because the true answer was politically inconvenient for the regime in power. This wasn't a case of scientists genuinely disagreeing about ambiguous evidence. It was a case of a government pressuring scientists to publicly misrepresent evidence that had already been thoroughly, repeatedly, and consistently resolved, stretching back to Randall McIver's original 1905 excavation and reinforced again by Caton Thompson in 1929. The suppression continued for decades after the science itself had already delivered its answer. That suppression only fully ended with Zimbabwean independence in 1980. When the newly formed government, led by a black-majority administration succeeding the Rhodesian settler regime, finally allowed the archaeological consensus that had existed for half a century to be publicly and officially acknowledged without political interference. The new nation even took its name directly from the ruins themselves, a deliberate, symbolically significant choice connecting the newly independent country's national identity directly back to the civilization colonial authorities had spent decades trying to deny belonged to Africans at all. The name Zimbabwe itself derives from the Shona phrase Zimba Zamapwe, meaning houses of stone, a direct linguistic reference to the very structures whose origins had been argued over for the better part of a century. Modern archaeological consensus, built on more than a century of accumulated excavation and analysis since Randall McIver's original 1905 dig, firmly identifies the builders of Great Zimbabwe as ancestors of the Shona people, a Bantu-speaking population whose descendants remain the largest ethnic group in modern Zimbabwe today. Radiocarbon dating places the earliest stone structures at the site back to roughly 600 CE, with the main phase of monumental construction, the enormous walls and enclosures most visitors associate with the site today, unfolding primarily between approximately 1100 and 1450 CE. Some archaeological and oral traditions specifically connect the site's later phases to the Rosvi dynasty, a powerful Shona political and military confederation that came to dominate the region during this same general period, though the full, precise political history connecting different phases of construction to specific ruling groups remains an area of ongoing research and academic discussion. The scale of what those Shona ancestors actually built deserves to be appreciated on its own terms, entirely apart from the political controversy that surrounded its recognition. The stonework at Great Zimbabwe was constructed using a specific dry stone technique, individual granite blocks shaped and fitted together with such precision that no mortar was ever needed to hold the structures together, a building method sophisticated enough that major sections of the walls have survived essentially intact for close to 1,000 years, through centuries of weather, seismic activity, and simple natural erosion. The site's economy rested on large-scale cattle herding, combined with extensive participation in Indian Ocean trade networks, bringing imported goods including Chinese porcelain and Persian glass beads deep into the African interior. Physical evidence recovered directly from the site confirming that Great Zimbabwe's rulers and merchants maintained genuine, sustained, long-distance trade connections reaching all the way across the Indian Ocean to civilizations thousands of miles away. The largest single structure at the site, known today as the Great Enclosure, remains the largest ancient structure built anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa south of the Egyptian pyramids, its outer wall stretching over 250 meters in circumference and reaching heights of up to 11 meters in places. All of it built without mortar, using nothing but carefully selected and shaped granite blocks, stacked with enough precision to bear their own enormous structural weight for centuries. Constructing something at that scale required not just skilled masons, but a genuinely sophisticated society behind them, organized labor on a large scale, a stable enough political system to sustain multi-generational building projects, and an economy productive enough to support workers who weren't directly engaged in growing food or herding cattle themselves. None of that fits comfortably alongside the colonial-era assumption that African societies in the region were too simple or too disorganized to have produced anything like it. That trade connection matters for understanding exactly how the foreign builder's myth managed to sustain itself for so long despite the mounting archaeological evidence against it. Imported goods recovered from the site, genuinely exotic, genuinely valuable items originating from distant civilizations, gave colonial-era skeptics a superficially plausible-sounding reason to doubt local origins, since the presence of foreign trade goods was sometimes misread, whether through genuine confusion or convenient motivated reasoning, as evidence of foreign builders rather than simply evidence of a sophisticated local civilization actively participating in long-distance trade on its own terms. The actual archaeological reality was straightforward. Local African rulers and merchants imported valuable foreign goods precisely because they possessed the wealth, organizational capacity, and trade connections to acquire them. Exactly the behavior you'd expect from a wealthy, well-organized state actively engaged in international commerce, not evidence that foreigners had built the state's capital city for them. There's a genuinely useful parallel worth drawing here to a separate but closely related case of colonial-era historical denial along Africa's eastern coast, one that has since been independently and directly confirmed using modern ancient DNA analysis rather than relying purely on artifact-based archaeology. The medieval Swahili coast, stretching along East Africa from Somalia down through Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique, was home to a wealthy, sophisticated network of trading city-states that, much like Great Zimbabwe, engaged extensively in Indian Ocean commerce, and, much like Great Zimbabwe, had its African origins repeatedly denied by colonial-era scholars who insisted the elite Swahili merchant class must have been primarily Persian or Arab in origin, rather than genuinely African. A landmark 2023 study published after researchers successfully extracted and sequenced ancient DNA from dozens of medieval skeletons recovered from Swahili coast burial sites, finally settled that specific question using direct genetic evidence rather than artifact interpretation alone. The results confirmed a genuinely mixed ancestry among the Swahili elite, roughly half African, primarily maternal lineages, and roughly half Persian, primarily paternal lineages, precisely mirroring what local Swahili oral tradition itself had been claiming for centuries, that Persian traders had settled among and intermarried with local African communities, rather than founding or ruling over some kind of purely foreign colonial outpost, the way certain colonial-era historians had insisted. The Swahili case offers a genuinely useful point of comparison for Great Zimbabwe, precisely because it shows a parallel colonial-era historical distortion, in this instance, actually getting corrected through direct genetic proof rather than through artifact analysis alone, reinforcing from an entirely independent scientific angle exactly the same broader pattern. Colonial authorities repeatedly, systematically underestimated and actively denied the sophistication of African civilizations across multiple entirely separate regions of the continent, using strikingly similar excuses each time. One archaeologist involved in Swahili coast research commenting on why colonial scholars had been so quick to invent foreign origin stories for African-built cities in the first place, put the underlying motive plainly. Crediting local Africans with building sophisticated, wealthy trading cities directly undermined the broader colonial narrative used to justify European rule across the continent. If African societies were already capable of building complex, prosperous, internationally connected civilizations on their own, the entire colonial premise that European rule was somehow bringing civilization to a previously incapable population collapsed immediately under its own weight. Denying African authorship of Great Zimbabwe and denying African authorship of the Swahili coast city-states weren't two unrelated historical footnotes. They were two local expressions of exactly the same broader ideological project, playing out independently across two entirely different regions of the African continent using remarkably similar invented foreign origin myths. Great Zimbabwe's own case never required ancient DNA to settle the underlying question, since the pottery, architectural, and artifact-based archaeological evidence had already been thoroughly conclusive since Caton Thompson's 1929 excavation. But the parallel with the Swahili coast findings matters anyway, because it demonstrates just how consistently and across how many entirely separate research methods and entirely separate regions of the African continent, the same basic colonial-era pattern kept repeating itself. Real, sophisticated, wealthy African civilizations, their origins persistently and specifically denied by outside observers unwilling to credit African populations with the achievement, followed eventually by modern research, whether archaeological or genetic, thoroughly and repeatedly confirming exactly what local oral tradition and eventually rigorous scientific excavation had been indicating clearly the entire time. What makes the Great Zimbabwe case particularly significant as a piece of history, beyond the specific archaeological facts about who built what and when, is how directly and how long the political suppression of already settled scientific fact actually continued. This wasn't a scientific mystery that took a long time to solve because the evidence itself was genuinely ambiguous or difficult to interpret. The evidence was clear by 1929. The suppression continued for another half-century after that, sustained specifically because the true, well-documented answer was politically inconvenient for the government controlling the territory where the ruins happened to sit. That's a genuinely different kind of historical injustice than simple ignorance or the ordinary, gradual pace of scientific discovery. It's a case of deliberate, sustained, government-directed distortion of an answer that competent researchers had already worked out decades earlier, maintained specifically because the truth threatened to undermine the political and racial hierarchy the colonial regime depended on to justify its own continued rule. Today, Great Zimbabwe stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, formally and internationally recognized for exactly what generations of local Shona oral tradition and eventually rigorous professional archaeology had always maintained. A genuine, sophisticated, wealthy African civilization built by African hands using African engineering knowledge, sustained by African cattle wealth and African participation in international trade networks stretching across the Indian Ocean. Less than 2% of the total site has been formally excavated and studied to date, according to recent academic assessments, meaning the full depth of what Great Zimbabwe's builders actually accomplished and the full detail of exactly how their society functioned, organized itself, and eventually declined by the 16th century, remains only partially understood even now, with the overwhelming majority of the site's archaeological potential still sitting, quite literally, unexcavated beneath the ground. That 2% figure is worth sitting with on its own because it means everything discussed so far, the great enclosure, the radiocarbon dates, the imported trade goods, the connections to the Rosvi dynasty, comes from a genuinely small fraction of the physical evidence still waiting underground at the site. Modern Zimbabwean archaeologists and heritage authorities, no longer operating under the political constraints their predecessors faced during the Rhodesian era, continue slowly expanding that excavated fraction, working with considerably more resources and considerably more institutional freedom than researchers had access to for most of the 20th century, but also working carefully and deliberately, aware that the site's significance as a national symbol means every new excavation carries weight well beyond pure academic interest. That remaining gap in the research isn't a mystery in the same sense the who built it question once was. Nobody studying Great Zimbabwe today seriously disputes that the Shona built it. The open questions that remain are considerably more specific and, in their own way, more genuinely interesting. Exactly how political power was organized and transferred across different phases of the site's roughly 8th-century occupation, exactly how the Rosvi dynasty and other Shona political groups related to earlier phases of construction and rule, and exactly what combination of factors, environmental pressure, shifting trade routes, political fragmentation, or some combination of all three, eventually drove the city's decline and abandonment by the time Portuguese traders first began documenting encounters with the region in the 16th century. Those are the genuine remaining mysteries. Whether Africans built Great Zimbabwe stopped being one of them roughly a century ago, even though it took political authorities considerably longer than that to admit it publicly. There's a final detail worth sitting with before closing this out, because it captures something genuinely significant about how historical truth and political power interact. The archaeological evidence proving African authorship of Great Zimbabwe existed, published, peer-reviewed, and professionally uncontested for roughly 50 years before Zimbabwean independence finally allowed that evidence to be spoken about freely and taught openly. For half a century, the correct answer to one of southern Africa's most significant archaeological questions sat fully documented in academic literature, while the government controlling access to the actual physical site continued telling visitors something different. That gap between what researchers definitively knew and what the public was officially permitted to be told is itself one of the most important parts of this entire story, a reminder that settling a factual question scientifically and settling it politically are sometimes two entirely separate battles, fought on entirely different timelines, with the second one occasionally taking decades longer to actually win. If a story like this, where a civilization's true origins were settled by real evidence decades before politics finally allowed that truth to be spoken openly, is the kind that stays with you, this exact pattern of colonial-era denial, followed by eventual hard-won vindication, keeps showing up again and again across the archaeological and genetic history of the African continent, each case its own specific example of real evidence eventually outlasting the political motives that tried to suppress it. And if there is a specific civilization, region, or historical mystery you've always wanted properly examined against the real evidence, drop it below, because that's exactly where the next one of these comes from.